what is that quote about? I would have written a shorter letter had I had more time, right? So it's so easy, I think, to just write long and just include everything that it is to go back and edit and figure out what's really critical to include here. So shorter is actually harder to write than longer, although it seems like it would actually be the opposite. It's actually shorter is harder. And why is that? I think it's because of that, because people don't think before they put out the ink.
The Email Copywriting Series by Litmus, because the words that we choose matter. Welcome, everyone, to Volume 1 of the Email Copywriting Series by Litmus. Writing for email may be one of the most difficult jobs in marketing. Different segments of your audience require different messaging. The devices your subscribers are using affect the perceived value of your copy. What's helpful on desktop may be long, laborious, and frustrating on a mobile device. In subject lines, you have just a few short words to compel your subscribers to open. Otherwise, all that copy you just wrote has significantly less impact. The words that we choose matter. This is why we launched the Email Copywriting Series, where we're going to have interviews with some of the top minds in writing to talk about how to write better emails. Our very first installment features Handley, who is the Chief Content Officer at Marketing Profs. And when it comes to writing well, there are very few people who get it more than Anne does. She quite literally wrote the book on content marketing. First with Content Rules, which she co-authored with C.C. Chapman, then with her most recent bestseller, Everybody Writes. Anne was doing content marketing back when it was still just called writing. She pioneered a movement when she founded ClickZ in 1997, which was one of the first sources of interactive marketing news and commentary on the web. Now, Anne publishes content through Marketing Profs, but also through her personal brand on AnneHandley.com, and writes some of the most compelling newsletters that there are. They're often also very short, which is very hard to do, and was the topic of my first question of Anne, which is, isn't writing short emails that are also relevant really hard?
So, first of all, I think that notion is more common than most people think. What is that quote about? I would have written a shorter letter had I had more time, right? So it's so easy, I think, to just write long and just include everything that it is to go back and edit and figure out what's really critical to include here. So shorter is actually harder to write than longer, although it seems like it would actually be the opposite. It's actually shorter is harder. And why is that? I think it's because of that, because people don't think before they put out the ink. So I think for me and for a lot of the most successful marketers that I see out there, I think the critical thing is to just sort of barf it up, barf up that first email. And Everybody Writes, I talk about barfing up a first draft, but I think it applies to email as well. And then go back and swap places with the recipient in a sense and figure out what is it that I'm really trying to convey here. Am I saying things as succinctly as I can, or am I just being sort of indulgent as a writer? Am I including too much detail, for example? Do I really need to add all this background, or can I just get right to the point? So I think just that simple act alone of writing what you want to write and then going back and editing it with an eye toward the recipient is just huge. And that sounds so obvious and so simple, but you should look at my inbox right now. It's just filled with emails that clearly somebody didn't do that. They just sort of threw it up there, and, a 10-paragraph or 5-paragraph email could have easily been half that.
And you call that word obesity too,
yes.
which I love that term. So one of your, and Everybody Writes, and we'll reference that a lot here, one of your cures for that is just using real words. We have a tendency, whether it's to sound smarter or to sound more professional, using bigger words, using bigger phrases. How do people avoid that 10-paragraph, really dense, word obese email? Like, how do we approach fixing that?
I mean, I think the key thing is what's the one thing that you're trying to convey? And it should only be one thing. You shouldn't have 4 or 5 or 6 different calls to action in there. And if you do, you should go back and rethink only sending one email. I think every email, and I would say actually every blog post and most everything that you put out there should just have one key point. You should be able to boil it down to not just an elevator speech, but literally, a tweet, right? You should be able to convey it in just a word, at least the key idea. Now, that doesn't mean that every email has to be that short, of course, but I think the key idea behind it should be really short and really succinct and really brief. So go back and figure out what that is, and right at the writing stage, super simple, just write it at the top of the page. I do this all the time with everything that I write. And I find that once you get clear on what it is that you're trying to say, I think building a short message around that and not wasting the audience's time, that's really key to a short message. Don't waste your audience's time. Don't be self-indulgent as a writer. So figure out what that thing is, and then just write your message around that.
You talk a lot too about pathological empathy, and I think when you're trying to connect in few words in a very short amount of time, it's all the more important to connect and resonate quickly, which that's what empathy is all about, right? So how important is empathy in writing email, and how do we achieve, quote unquote, pathological empathy? What does that look like?
Yeah. I mean, the notion of pathological empathy really means to focus relentlessly on the recipient. And, it's something that you can work at. I don't think that we are all naturally empathic. You really do need to put yourself in the mindset of the recipient, of the person that you're writing to. And so I think, just having enormous empathy for the problems that they have, for the solutions that you offer, and not just talking about the features and benefits of, whatever it is that you're promoting, but really putting it in the terms of what does it do for them. I think a really easy place to apply that is in your call to action, right? Have a very specific call to action. And Everybody Writes, I talk about this, and I love what Joanna Wiebe of Copy Hackers, the way that she terms it. And she describes this approach when she says, don't amplify the act of proceeding, amplify the value of it. So not free trial, but end scheduling hassles. So that's just it's a subtle shift, but it's an important one, right? Because you suddenly realize this isn't just about starting a free trial. It's actually about what it does, what that free trial will do for the recipient, which is to, in this case, end scheduling hassles.
Yeah. And a lot of that is dependent, obviously, on knowing, as you said before, having that pathological empathy, knowing what the audience is looking for, knowing what their pain points are.
Yeah.
So how do successful companies match their message to their audience? Like, what are some ways, and this might sound rudimentary, but it's actually really difficult for a lot of companies to achieve. How do they find the right message? Like, how do they find what those problems are? Is it just by talking to them? Like, what are some ways that people can be sure that they're hitting the right level of empathy and they're really resonating with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, certainly look at your data, but I think you also just said it, talk to them. In my experience, a lot of marketers don't actually talk to customers. Sales talks to customers, customer service talks to customers, but a lot of times marketing doesn't. And so, just make it a point to have conversations with the people that you're actually communicating with. That may be as simple as, picking up a phone every once in a while and calling 5 or 6 or 7 customers and just sort of, getting a feel for what their pain points are, what their problems are. Or it could be just sending out a quick survey, couple of key points, couple of issues that you want to ask about, and make it a point to do that regularly, not once a year or once every 5 years, but, once a quarter, say. Keep your pulse on, what is it that what are the issues of marketers? At Marketing Profs, I actually get a lot of insight just by listening on Twitter. So not just sharing and broadcasting on Twitter and other social networks like LinkedIn, for example, is another good platform to do this. But just listening to what marketers talk about and showing up at tweet chats, not to talk as much as just to hear the conversation, just understanding what the point of view is from marketers at, an IT company or a professional services company or what have you, so even that kind of social prospecting, I think can yield a lot of data that you can then use to inform the content or the email that you're putting out there.
And then what you hear too from a lot of companies is, well, our product or our market isn't really is kind of boring. It's not really sexy. We can't have a lot of fun with our copy. But you see a lot of companies in industries that are traditionally more buttoned up have a lot of fun with their copy. So how can brands strike that balance between having a personality, which you clearly do through your own blog, through Handley.com, but also, there is a business, you need to achieve revenue and achieve business outcomes. So how do brands strike that balance? Or is there even a balance to be struck? Is being personable should that always be, of utmost importance?
It really depends on who you are as a company, as a brand. In my experience, a lot of companies can't easily define that, so they say, yes, we're a fun company and we have a certain point of view, but when you ask them to actually define it, like to put 3 words to what that actually means, they can't. So when I ask them to well, tell me what your 3 brand attributes are, what is your brand voice? If you covered up the logo on your website, do you sound like everybody else? If the label fell off, would people know it's you? And very often the answer is no. And a lot of companies just haven't really done that exercise and they don't really know who they are. So I think really, I believe personally that every brand is human and should speak, directly to the humans they're trying to connect with. But, maybe that doesn't feel right for some companies. And certainly if that's not the way you feel, then what are you? Then who are you? But I think a super simple thing that brands can do is just as I said, come up with the 3 attributes that define, who you are as a company and what you're like to deal with, and a little bit about your culture. So one of my favorite examples for that is M&R Consulting. They're an agency that helps nonprofits use social tools to market more effectively, to get more folks involved in their cause, to raise more funds, that kind of thing. And so they describe themselves in 3 ways. One is weirdly creative, one is scrappy, and what's the third one? I'm completely blanking on it right now. Something like whatever it takes. So those 3 things put together, actually smart, weirdly creative, and scrappy. Those are their 3 things. So essentially what that means is that everything that they put out has those attributes. And so they give a sense of what they're like to deal with. And they're risky as well. That's actually another one of their brand attributes. So everything that they put out comes from that place, right? It comes from that tone of voice. And so I think they're using that to differentiate themselves as a brand and as a company, and also, sort of broadcast what kind of company they are and what they're like to deal with. And so I think just differentiating yourself, using your voice to differentiate is really a huge advantage.
How about you personally, through your own website? You're somebody who nails the personality and the personalization really well. Like when I get an email that's from a blog post that you wrote or any sort of copy that you've put out, I mean, I guess I sort of have the unfair advantage because we email personally sometimes, but I think that you wrote this email just for me. And then it's like, oh, this is a blog post that went out to her entire massive email list, I'm sure. So how do you do that? Like, cause you see like so many companies, the personalization to them is using their automation software to insert like, hey there, Anne, did you know that XYZ? So, yeah, but that's not personalization, right? So no. How do you manage that to be so personable? And this was written just for me, because obviously I'm not the only one on your mailing list. So like, how do you approach that? What are some tips marketers can use to make their personalization more successful?
Well, first of all, pay attention to your writing and really value the writing as a way to convey all these things that we're talking about. So don't do what you just said. Personalization does not mean just, dear, F name here, right? Dear Anne or dear John, instead what it means is, really taking that human tone and thinking about writing to one specific person. I do that all the time in my own writing on my own blog. I always think about who is this really going to help, so just coming at it from that perspective and writing to one person and not just the sort of, nameless, faceless mass of people. I think just that alone can help. The other thing is, I think it's really important for companies to come at their marketing from a point of humility almost, right? In the sense that to respect their audience, to really put themselves out there as somebody who's supporting their audience to whatever degree they can, and just speak with them with humility and humanity. A lot of times we don't even hear that, So I don't know. I think just starting there, I think is just a great place to start. If you have nothing else to go on, at least go on that.
So we can't talk about writing emails if we don't talk about this question that gets asked all the time, which there's no right answer to. So I'm selling this question really well, as you can tell. But, one of the questions that gets asked all the time is, how long should my email be? What's the proper length for body copy? If it's people don't like to read, you hear that all the time. Me personally, I think people just don't like to read crappy emails or blog posts. They'll be happy to read really great, ridiculously awesome long ones. Right. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So when people ask you that, through marketing profs or at a keynote session that you're giving, if somebody, like, when anybody asks you about length in relation to copy, how do you approach answering that?
Yeah. So, in general, I think shorter is better. But, and I think brevity always rules, so I always think that, if you can say it more simply, you should. But, but on the other hand, if what you're writing really does have value for the customer, and if you really do need more space to convey the message that you're trying to convey, I'm not against long messages. What I am against is wasting the time of the audience. And so I think as long as you are respecting the audience, as long as you come at it with a point of humility, in other words, I think it's completely fine to write as long as you need to. But again, nothing self-indulgent, right? Don't waste the time of your audience.
Speaking of not wasting time of your audience, any company, any brand, any consultant, personal consultant, whatever it is going to have a segment of their list that at some point is unresponsive. For a variety of reasons, they don't unsubscribe, but you get a ton of emails sent, and there's a big segment of your audience that just isn't engaging with your emails. You could either leave them alone, but somebody like you with a lot of personality, and you sort of have this touch, like, how would you approach, or how would you, advise somebody on approaching a segment of their database that may be really unengaged and unresponsive? Like, what type of copy, if any, could be used to draw these people back in and be interested in the content that you're putting out?
So how do you re-engage a non-responsive email list?
An unresponsive email list, yes.
Yeah, that's a tough one. If you are routinely emailing people who are ignoring your messages, I think what I would do is just send them a simple and direct message, some sort of dedicated message directly to that segment, and just say, do you want to be on this list? Do you find value in it? And offer them an opportunity to speak back to you, right? I think that's the promise of social, but it's certainly the promise of digital marketing as well. Is just to, ask people, what is it that that isn't satisfying you in this particular exchange, so what is it exactly? And you may find that, that they're just, for whatever reason, that it's just not going to be anything that they're interested in. That's okay. I guess, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time trying to re-engage people who aren't interested in me. I may give them one last shot, but ultimately it's like, if they're not interested in you, they're not interested in you, right? So I don't think it's really a wise action to try to re-engage people who aren't interested after you give it, one last shot.
Sure. And everybody writes. We've already talked about it several times, but in the book you talk about a lot of writing rules for different areas of copy and content. So when it comes to email, like, what, when you sit down to write, like, what are some of the, maybe, these subconscious writing rules for writing email for somebody that writes at your level?
I don't think my approach to writing email is all that different than it is to writing anything, and some of the things that we talked about here today, I think definitely also apply in email, thinking about the recipient as being one person, not just a customer segment or not just a mass of people, but really writing to one person. I find that enormously helpful just because it does allow me two things. First of all, it allows me to communicate in a more natural tone, right? A more natural voice where I feel like I'm just talking to one person in the space of their email box and not say, hundreds of thousands who may be getting this. And then the other thing it does, I think, is it just forces you to really think about what value you're trying to convey when you do think about one person. And so that approach, I think, definitely works in email. But, as it happens, it's also the same approach that I take when I write a blog post, for example. It's the same approach that I took when I wrote Everybody Writes. I tried to think about one person who would find this super helpful. So that's the way that I approach it. Second thing is, though, I think using real images in your email, like I know we're talking about writing, but I think the images that you use are equally as important. And obviously, an image can convey a whole lot. So using real images and not stock images whenever you can, or to the degree that you can, I also think is another great way to think about any email that you're doing.
That wraps up Volume 1 of the Email Copywriting Series. We'd like to thank Ann Handley for talking email with us, and we'd also like to thank you for caring so much about the craft of email that you are here learning how to write better ones. Be sure to check out the next and future volumes of the Email Copywriting Series, which can be found at the Litmus blog at litmus.com/blog. See you next time.